This is great because I'm not going to say it's like speed dating, but we have 20 minutes together. We've had a really robust conversation in the speaker's lounge. I would invite those in the audience, if you want to move up into the seats, there's no limitations to VIP seating and the rest if you want to get an up close and personal view of Mike. There's a lot to cover in the 20 minutes, and we've talked about the energy transition. Has the discussion or the needle moved fast enough for people to understand the role of the mining and the mineral development sectors to be able to deliver a transition? Or do we still have different camps kind of holding on to their turf and the collaboration not there?
Look, so really interesting question, John, and it's how long is a piece of string? So if things move quickly, absolutely. Compared to to the understanding of the urgency required for the energy transition, the importance of mining, if you roll back 2 or 3 years, that understanding just wasn't there. Whereas now, and we saw this with the ministerial roundtable yesterday, really broad-based understanding of the critical nature of critical minerals, the urgency with which those minerals need to be invested in and brought to market. But even at the current pace, we're not going to be able to meet the world's demand for these minerals in time. So there's still yet more to happen, but momentum's building, and I'm optimistic that we will get to where we need to be in reasonably short order.
Good. There's one which is, people talk about the narrative around the mining companies, and I say coming out of the shadows.
Yeah.
It's kind of, as a CEO, it's kind of no news is good news, but that doesn't solve the problem of the understanding of what's needed for permitting, the ability to attract investment, the policies needed to support it. So can you address the narrative, but actually the performance and the ability to deliver on the necessary minerals that are needed for wind, battery storage, solar, and the next generation of technology?
Okay, so let's calibrate first on what's needed. So over the next 30 years, in order to meet the needs of the energy transition, the world's going to need 2 times as much copper, 4 times as much nickel, 2 times as much steel, therefore 2 times as much iron ore, coke and coal, and so on and so forth, as was needed over the past 30 years. Now, the amount of mining required to unlock those resources is going to be even more significant because they're going to be coming from lower grade deposits. So you might see a 3 times as much copper mining needed, 6 times as much nickel mining needed. But at the same time, the time to get from first discovery to first production has gone from, 10 years, 20 years ago, to now 20 years. So it's taking a lot more time to get these deposits developed. Now, what's driving that is more onerous kind of processes, oftentimes overlapping processes, more red tape to get from point A to point B, all of that sitting within the control of government. But governments are responding to local community concerns or the electorate's concerns. Now, what we're seeing today is a much enhanced understanding on the part of governments of the importance of mining, the need to bring these resources on quickly. I don't think that's yet being matched by the understanding of the person in the street. And so I think there's more, coming back to your question, John, about the narrative, there's more that the industry needs to be doing to lean into promoting the importance of the industry, to talking about the good that the industry is doing. But that all needs to start with the industry setting and upholding higher standards. Because frankly, if it's just about the narrative and rhetoric, but the industry isn't upholding high standards, we're not doing the right thing by way of creating social value for all those who depend on and support the mining industry, then the narrative isn't going to get us that far. Now, a lot of that work is happening at the individual company level, but it's also happening at the industry level through bodies like the ICMM, where you have the top mining companies in the world coming together to talk about some of the challenges that lie ahead, seeking to align on higher standards, and then figuring out how we can go about meeting those higher standards.
But it's interesting, in the work that ICMM's doing, it's based in London, and we've had conversations with them about how do you get that conversation out of this conference center?
Yes.
How do we get it outside the tent of the mining industry? And if we can have a frank conversation, do some in the environmental community not want to have a dialogue with you? Can you get all the players around the table so you reach the consumer and they understand the role of mining, Mike? Is that too ambitious?
So I'm optimistic, but I'm not so optimistic to say that you're going to get everybody around the table and everybody supportive of mining, because there's some who just have such a deep-seated negative view of mining that they're never going to be there. But you don't need everybody there. You need sufficient support, sufficient understanding in order to be able to move the dial on policy, on the way capital markets are working, and so on. Now, what's required to do that? It requires mining to be more front-footed in terms of its engagement with the media, with the public, but it also requires governments to be out there promoting the importance of mining. And sometimes I think, it can be difficult for governments because there may be a temptation at times to, call the industry out for some of the less good stuff that happens in industry, and sometimes there will be a populist drive towards talking negatively about the industry. But at the same time, we have to recognize that unless we can get the public on side, it's going to be difficult for us to bring projects on at the pace that projects need to be brought on. And there's a collective interest here on the part of governments, on the part of industry, on the part of capital markets, to get out there and tell the positive story of the sector. Transparency, super critical. So it can't be kind of a naive positive narrative around the industry. It has to be truthed in past performance in the industry, which hasn't always been to the standards that we would promote today. But by the same token, governments need to be talking about just how important the industry is, need to be clear about the opportunity that presents for nations. And we've seen here with the Kingdom and the roundtable that happened yesterday, there's a clear understanding of the opportunity presented by the mining sector, and a real understanding of what's needed on the part of governments, both at the individual government level, but across regions as well, to come together to promote the changes that are required to see capital invested and projects brought on to meet the energy transition.
What standards do you need to follow as a global player? Because I've been covering ESG for about a decade, and if you take a step back, the standards in the United States or on Wall Street vis-a-vis London or the European capitals or Asia differ. And do you get a commonality? But does it hamper you as terms of investors, like university endowments in the United States? If the students don't want to invest in mining, can they touch it? What sort of debate are you having inside the boardroom?
So I wish it were just the U.S. versus Europe versus Asia. The reality is within the U.S. you'll have different policy or different standards. Within Europe you'll have different standards. And it's a bit of the friction of good intent. And so, with this growing recognition of just what the energy transition is going to demand by way of more copper, more nickel, and so on, coupled with a growing understanding of the potential unintended negative ESG consequences if that increase in production isn't managed effectively, that good intent is manifesting itself in a plethora of new standards. So lots of new standards being developed. And what that does is create a dilemma for investors, for example. Which standard do they apply in determining who they're going to invest in? It creates a lot of friction for companies like BHP because we're out there trying to meet many different new standards, oftentimes on the same topic, but this creates organizational deadweight or it creates organizational drag. And if I could wave a magic wand, I would love to be able to get governments, standard setters, industry, capital markets, ESG ratings agencies, all around the table to align on the fewer number of high standards that we can all then invest our effort in, because that would allow us to move more quickly. Again, I come back to the conversation that the Kingdom has stimulated yesterday, which is involved multiple governments or senior level government representatives from Asia, from Middle East, Africa, and South America, and North America, to promote these conversations, which are multi-stakeholder in nature, bringing together different parties to align on a fewer set of higher standards that we can all then get behind.
Interesting. This is a very challenging times because particularly the OECD countries, they were the lender or provider of last resort during the pandemic, as you know. They opened up the coffers, now supplying subsidies for energy. And I'm living in the UK. It's been quite a major bill, and it's a similar story around the world. What danger does that pose if you can't predict tax policy, for example, and there's a populist fervor, and they're like, okay, we need to hit the wealthy. We go to the top 5% of society, and then we say, oh, that's a mining company, that's an oil and gas company. We've seen this with oil and gas, right, with the taxes that have been applied. What does that mean for you, Mike?
Well, so it's, again, I come back to some of those statistics I used earlier around the amount of, or the increased mining activity that's going to be required for the world to meet the energy transition. That's not going to happen without private capital. What is the single biggest killer of investment? It's uncertain fiscal policy. And right now there's a populist temptation on the part of many governments to ding the mining sector. You're seeing higher commodity prices. The temptation will be there to get in and increase taxes, corporate taxes, royalty rates, and so on and so forth in response to short-term circumstances. I don't know that there's an adequate understanding of what that does to investments, because as the CEO of the world's largest mining company, if I'm needing to make a decision, or I and the board are needing to make a decision about where to invest shareholder funds, it's very difficult to do that if you don't have confidence in the underlying fiscal regime. So if you don't have a level of certainty around the taxation rate that you're going to be paying, it becomes difficult then to model the returns that you can expect on a project. And oftentimes then what will happen is that capital will flow to investments in other jurisdictions, or it will flow out of the industry. So the push then will be for more of that capital flow back to shareholders who can invest it in other opportunities where they do have greater certainty around the underlying fiscal terms. And unless governments are willing to provide that level of certainty, which I think is quite a reasonable expectation on the part of shareholders in the industry, then I think that is one of the risks to the world's ability to meet the energy transition.
Good. Before I spend our last 7 minutes, I wanted to talk to you about what's being developed here in the kingdom and your view on your first visit here. But what would you suggest is the greatest risk in 2023? You have that medium and long-term risk, right, because of the policy challenges that we talked about. But you're a major player when it comes not just to the mining industry, but in the kind of global 100 companies and CEOs. What should this audience look out for in 2023 and 24? How do you map it yourself?
Yeah, 2023, 2024, obviously there's the uncertainty out there around what happens with kind of overall global economic recovery. China appears to be coming strongly out of kind of the recent COVID wave and the economy picking up there. Outlook around the U.S. economy, I think there's a growing sense that the U.S. will end up in a recession. But those sorts of things, at the end of the day, for our industry, for governments, they're all short-term in nature.
Yes.
And I don't think that should be the primary focus. I think if that uncertainty and some of the near-term drag out there results in a slowing up of investment in new mining projects or a slowing up of investment in exploration, that creates long-term risks to the ability to meet the energy transition. So I think, being able to see through that near-term uncertainty for governments, as the kingdom has done, to continue to look at how they can go about putting in place policies that attract investment, that accelerate the development of these mineral resources projects, I think that's going to be, that needs to be a focus over the next couple of years. And it's certainly from a BHP perspective, we've spent a lot of time ensuring that we've got a balance sheet in place, that we've got an approach to capital allocation in place that allows us to see through near-term cycles, to continue to invest through the cycle, both in exploration and in project development. And it's all with that understanding that if you allow your approach to spend and capital allocation to be dragged along by the cycles, that detracts from long-term shareholder value creation.
Very interesting. The kingdom here has put forward an investment code or investment law at the start of 2021.
Yeah.
They're going to try to develop 3 to 5 domestic mining companies to join Ma'aden and the others that are already on the market. This is your first visit. Are you open to collaborate? Do you think that this model, being the third pillar for growth, is the real deal? And what attracts you to the kingdom itself?
So it's definitely the real deal. And look, if we look at what the kingdom's done, they've set out a very clear strategy. They're backing that strategy. They're engaging in multilateral or multi-stakeholder engagement in pursuit of that strategy. In many respects, that's what industry needs to be doing. So it's actually very similar to the way that we've thought about BHP and some of the changes that we've been putting in place over the past few years around, clear strategy around backing the energy transition. It happens to be the most valuable scenario for BHP, a faster decarbonizing of the world. We've then started allocating capital to that. That underpins all of the capital investment decisions that we've made. We've recognized that that doesn't happen unless we've got the support of local communities, of governments, and so on. And so we've embedded a new approach to social value creation, which is about ensuring that all of what we do is informed by the value that gets created, not just for shareholders, but also for the other stakeholders who depend upon BHP, and that gets embedded through all of our decisions. That's exactly what we see happening in the kingdom here. I hope that other governments will look to emulate the model being adopted in the kingdom here, because through that, we can we'll make investment in the sector more attractive. We'll be able to bring projects on more quickly, both here in the kingdom, but also elsewhere. And in bringing them on more quickly, it will make them more cost effective as well. Because one of the things that increases the cost of the capital cost of bringing on new projects is time. And if you can shorten that time frame up, it makes the capital cost of new projects lower. That lowering of capital costs is ultimately going to make the cost of these new of copper, nickel, and so on, lithium, to support the energy transition lower.
Good. I was talking to you in the green room, if you will, about global mapping. And it seems like it creates an opportunity for Saudi Arabia, the overdependency on China for processing of minerals, this being the logistical supply chain for the mining industry. So, and mining upstream, the midstream, and the downstream here.
Yes.
And this connectivity between Africa, particularly Central and Eastern Africa, through the Middle East, to the Gulf, into Central Asia. Can that vision be realized? Does it make sense at this time to reduce our dependency on just a couple of centers in the mining industry?
So look, let me put it this way, John. I think the value of resilience, both from a corporate perspective and from a governmental perspective, the value in having resilient supply chains has gone up post-pandemic. And it's not just driven by the pandemic; it's being driven by some of the geopolitical shifts that we're seeing unfold in the world today. Against that backdrop of higher need for resilience, coupled with the significant changes that are going to occur in metal commodity markets in the coming years because of the energy transition, I think does provide a real opportunity. And the kingdom is well placed geographically relative to kind of where some of the demand centers are going to be. It's highly prospective domestically in terms of being able to unlock more of these minerals as well out of the Arabian Shield. And of course, it has the benefit of being able to develop a low-cost green energy. So I think those all provide good conditions for the success of the strategy.
Good. Final thing, we've got about a minute and a half. This is your first trip to the kingdom. I think I've been here 50 times over about 30 years, but it's accelerated now. What are your first impressions? And you're taking a week to kind of kick the tires, if you will, or to take a look at the landscape. What are your first impressions of the transformation?
Well, so it's obvious. Now, I don't have a reference point to look back to, but the energy here has exceeded even my high expectations. So why am I here? I'm here because I was hearing increasing talk about the kingdom's focus, the seriousness with which the third pillar kind of is being pursued. Others in industry were telling me that this is real and it's something you need to get closer to. So I came to Riyadh with pretty high expectations in terms of what it was going to feel like, who I would be seeing around the table, kind of double that or triple that in terms of what I've experienced over the past couple of days, which I think is great for the kingdom, but it leaves me with a greater sense of optimism for what's possible. And that, not just within the kingdom, but that other governments are getting it, and the need for more mining, and that there's a greater degree of collaboration happening, in this case being led by the kingdom, between governments and between other actors in the system. Because absent that, if each actor is pursuing their kind of individual interests, and there isn't an openness to collaboration, we won't achieve what needs to be achieved to meet the energy transition. And so it's been very encouraging to see that conversation being stimulated by the Kingdom, and the seriousness with which that conversation is being taken by the others that were there at the ministerial roundtable yesterday.
Good, and we talked about that collaboration. So the African presence here at the Future Mineral Forum and the Central Asian presence is kind of an indication of where people want to take that journey, I think.
And even further, I mean, there's representation here from South America, North America. So it is, I mean, it's obviously a very significant conference and very significant conversation.
Great. Can we give a nice round of applause? Mike Henry is the
Thank you.
CEO of BHP. That was a lot of fun, but that was a very quick 20 minutes. Nice to see you.